This is a reading of Carol L. King's What is Gnosticism, with some side commentary here and there. So let's get started. What is Gnosticism? Came out in 2003, Harvard University Press. Got the chapters here. We'll get to them, get to all of it eventually. But I can't read this all at once, so we're going to take it in chunks. All right, in the preface we have: historians are in the process of rewriting history of earliest Christianity, partly on the basis of newly discovered papyrus manuscripts containing a wealth of previously unknown early Christian texts. Not only do we have new discoveries, but we also have new questions to address those materials. Issues of pluralism, colonialism, difference, and marginality all appear in our scholarship with increasing frequency. Specialists are developing new methods and reconsidering past theoretical paradigms and frameworks. At this time, we are only able to catch a glimpse of what new narratives of early Christian history will look like. But one point is assured by the new discoveries: early Christianity was much more diverse and pluriform than any could have suspected a century ago. Moreover, historians will have to write a story in which Christian triumph over pagan culture and Christian supersession of Judaism no longer have an unambiguous historical grounding, and in which women are an active presence. The surviving literature from antiquity attests that Christians of the first centuries were deeply engaged in controversies over such basic issues as the meaning of Jesus's teaching, the significance of his death, the roles of women, sexuality, visions of ideal community, and much more. When disputes arose, however, there were no structures in place to decide who was right or wrong. No New Testament canon, no Nicene Creed, no fixed hierarchical male leadership, no Christian emperor. The history of early Christianity is therefore not only the story of those controversies, but also the account of the invention of those structures. My own interest, which lies primarily in early Christianity, early Christian identity formation, and the critique of current scholarly categories of analysis, has been shaped largely through the study of Gnostic heresy, supposedly emerging in the Greek and Roman colonial world of the ancient Mediterranean. Gnosticism has been defined both in antiquity and in contemporary discourse by difference and marginality. It has been called heretical, syncretistic, oriental, radical, rebellious, and parasitic. This book does not provide a description of all the group's texts and ideas that have been attributed to Gnosticism, nor is it an exhaustive account of the study of Gnosticism in the 20th century. Rather, it aims to contribute to the larger enterprise of rewriting the history of Christianity by examining how modern historiography came to invent a new religion, Gnosticism, largely out of early Christian polemics, intersecting with post-Enlightenment historicism, colonialism, and existential phenomenology. I have to cough here. Hold on a second. This book also aims to identify where certain assumptions that were formed in ancient battles against heresy continue to operate in the methods of contemporary historiography, especially regarding those constructions of purity, origins, and essence, in which difference is figured as divisive, mixing as pollution, and change as deviance. I suggest only that these assumptions are entangled in academic methodologies, but also that they continue to support particular notions of religious normativity and operations of identity politics in our own day. A historian of the ancient world, as a historian of the ancient world, I am also concerned that the current understanding of Gnosticism distorts our reading of the ancient texts, oversimplifies our account of early Christianity, and confounds the use of historical resources for theological reflection. Asking the question, what is Gnosticism, can help remedy these problems and open new vistas for investigating the terrain of ancient Christianity, as well as the dynamics of contemporary identity politics. This book has been in the making for at least 20 years. During that time, I have profited enormously from conversations with numerous colleagues, friends, and students to whom I owe a great debt for their criticisms and encouragement. Unfortunately, it is not possible for me to name them all here. But I would like to acknowledge my appreciation. My sincerest thanks goes as well to the individual colleagues and organizations who made it possible to present initial ideas and drafts on various occasions at the Gaston Symposium, University of Oregon, Eugene, the Annenberg Institute, Philadelphia, the Institute for Antiquity and Christianity, Claremont, California, the Women's Studies Seminar of the Huntington Library, Pasadena, California, Harvard Divinity School, Cambridge, Massachusetts, the Center for the Study of Religion in Public Life, Trinity College, Hartford, Connecticut, the 1999 Showers Lectures in Christian Religion, University of Indianapolis, Indiana, Thomas L. King Lecture in Religious Studies, Washburn University, Topeka, Kansas, Remsen Bird Lecture, Occidental College, Los Angeles, California, Fifth International Congress of Coptic Studies, 1992, Catholic University of America, Washington, D.C., Congress of International Association of the History of Religions, Rome, 1990, and Mexico City, 1995, a plenary address for the North American Patristic Society, Chicago, Illinois, and various national meetings of the Society of Biblical Literature and the American Academy of Religion, a plenary address at the 19 address, rather not address, address. She's addressing at these things. A plenary address at the 1998 regional AAR meeting, and an invited lecture at the 1999 international SBL meeting in Helsinki and Lahti, Finland. Not sure about these names. The latter, anyway. Earlier versions of a few points of my argument appeared in the following articles: Translating History, Reframing Gnosticism in Postmodernity, pages 264 to 277, in Tradition Translation, a bunch of German words I don't know or pronounce correctly. Editor Christoph Elsis et al., Berlin, Walter de Gruyter, 1984. Machinations on Myth and Origins, pages 157 to 172, in Reimagining Christian Origins, a colloquium honoring Burton L. Mack, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, Trinity Press International, 1996, and Politics of Syncretism and the Problem of Defining Gnosticism, pages 461 to 479, in Historical Reflections Historiques, I guess Chronicle 27, Volume 3, or something like that, 2001. Warm thanks warm thanks go to Tom Hall, who edited the entire manuscript sans reimbursement. His wit, wisdom, and unforgiving attitude toward misuse of the English language saved me from many infelicities while providing many a chuckle. My thanks also to Margaretta Fulton, my editor at Harvard University Press, for her support, and to Christine Thorsteinson for her editorial labor. I would also like to offer special thanks to colleagues who, at various points, gave me invaluable feedback and encouragement. Virginia Burris, Anne McGuire, Patricia Cox Miller, Laura Nasrallah, Karen Jo Torjensen, I'm not sure, and Dale Wright. My deepest gratitude belongs to Daniel Boyarin, Elaine Pagels, Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, and Hal Talsig for their constant support, unfailingly helpful criticism, and generosity in giving precious time to reading full drafts of the manuscript. The book's remaining shortcomings are my own, but many strengths came from their help at crucial moments. Most precious of all to me is the sweetness of this friendship among colleagues. For that there is warmest affection rather. Abbreviations for literary works. I'm not going to go through all these. It's a bunch of them. We have a quote here from George Eliot. It looks like, quote, "Men can do nothing without the make-believe of a beginning. Even science, the strict measurer, is obliged to start with a make-believe unit and must fix on a point in the stars' unceasing journey when his sidereal clock shall pretend that time is at naught. His less accurate grandmother poetry has always been understood to start in the middle, but on reflection it appears that her proceeding is not very different from his, since science too reckons backwards as well as forwards, divides his unit into billions, and with his clock finger at naught really sets off in media res. No retrospect will take us to the true beginning, and whether our prologue be in heaven or on earth, it is but a fraction of that, all presupposing facts with which our story sets out." George Eliot, Daniel Deronda, 1876. Introduction. In 1945, an Egyptian farmer named Muhammad Ali, well, isn't that an interesting name, went out into the hills near the town of Nag Hammadi to dig for fertilizer. By serendipity, he uncovered a clay jar. In it were 4th century CE papyrus books containing nearly 46 different works, most of which had previously been unknown. There were new gospels, including the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Truth, recounting unknown sayings of Jesus and interpreting his death and resurrection not in terms of sin and atonement, but as enlightenment, overcoming ignorance and suffering. There were grand myths telling of the creation of the world and humanity by the wicked God of Genesis, who sought only to dominate the divine spark in humanity and imprison it in mortal flesh. There were stories of Mary Magdalene as a spiritual disciple and leader, as well as feminine images of God. There were hymns and prayers, oracles and wisdom sayings, and much more. Almost from the beginning, the find was characterized as a Gnostic library. But what is Gnosticism? Although scholars have expended considerable effort on determining the origin and development of Gnosticism, delimiting its background and sources, and defining its essence, no consensus had been established on any of these issues. The situation has only been aggravated by the discovery of new texts, which are seriously challenging some of the most basic elements of a minimal definition of Gnosticism. Specialists are recognizing more and more that previous definitions of Gnosticism are inadequate to interpret the new textual materials without seriously distorting them. Why is it so hard to define Gnosticism? The problem, I argue, is that a rhetorical term has been confused with a historical entity. There was and is no such thing as Gnosticism. If we mean by that some kind of ancient religious entity with a single origin and a distinct set of characteristics, Gnosticism is, rather, a term invented in the early modern period to aid in defining the boundaries of normative Christianity, yet it has mistakenly come to be thought of as a distinctive Christian heresy or even as a religion in its own right, and libraries are replete with books describing its central beliefs, discussing its origins, and considering its history. But having said that no religion called Gnosticism existed in antiquity, we still have to account for all the ideas, writings, persons, and practices described by ancient polemicists, not to mention the texts found at Nag Hammadi and elsewhere. If they are not Gnostic, what are they? How are we to locate them historically and interpret them? Some have responded to this challenge by turning away from definitional tasks altogether, at least for the time being. Gershom Scholem has summarized this general sentiment by pointing out that, quote, research into the problems of Gnosticism, which has entered a new phase in our generation, is still far removed from a state where valid generalizations can be established with any amount of confidence. This is largely due to the prevalence of hypotheses which rest on tenuous foundations. What is needed most, as it seems to me, is the analysis of details on which such general conclusions could be built, end quote. Indeed, generalizations must be based on detailed and disciplined studies of the primary materials in order to guard against superficiality, arbitrariness, and partiality. Until these studies have progressed further, it might be prudent to suspend the use of the term, along with the definitions and categories associated with it, since at this point generalizations about Gnosticism seem counterproductive. Scholars have not, however, found it possible to dispense with the term altogether, although we have been working to point out the deficiencies in previous definitions of Gnosticism. Few think that we can get along without the term. The main reason is that it continues to do seemingly indispensable intellectual work. But what work is Gnosticism doing? What problem or interpretive framework requires it? The initial insight is quite simple. The problem of defining Gnosticism has been primarily concerned with the normative identity of Christianity. Gnosticism has been constructed largely as the heretical other in relation to diverse and fluctuating understandings of Orthodox Christianity. This means that modern historical constructions of Gnosticism reflect many of the characteristics and strategies used by early Christian polemicists like Irenaeus and Tertullian to construct heresy. Although the two constructions are by no means identical, the continuities between discourses of heresy and characterizations of Gnosticism are notable. This is true both for typological definitions of Gnosticism and for attempts to define Gnosticism historically by locating its origins and tracing its development. Indeed, it is largely a it is largely apologetic concerns to defend normative Christianity that make Gnosticism intelligible as a category at all. As in comparable dualistic categories of self and other, such as citizen/foreigner, Greek/barbarian, Jew/Gentile, Christian/pagan, the other achieves its existence and identity only by contrast to the self. Such categories are totally inadequate when it comes to understanding the tremendous social and cultural diversity of those others because they were invented, not due to justice to the groups and materials they encompass, but to satisfy the needs of defining the self. In this way, the category of Gnosticism was produced through the Christian discourse of orthodoxy and heresy. The result is an artificial entity reified by applying elements of heresiological, I butchered that one, discourse to the historical materials grouped under the rubric of Gnosticism, such as Gnosticism has been classified as a marginal, sectarian, esoteric, mythical, syncretistic, parasitic, and oriental religion in contrast to mainstream, authentic, ethnic, historical, rational, or universal religions such as Orthodox Christianity. Such characterizations are more useful for the politics of religious polemic than for historical inquiry. So long as the category of Gnosticism continues to serve as the heretical other of Orthodox Christianity, it will be inadequate for interpretation of the primary materials and for historical reconstruction. Although I fully agree with the proposition that Gnosticism is an unhelpful, artificial, and rhetorical construction, and no less a construct than Judaism, Christianity, Oriental religion, paganism, or other terms of religious identity. I do not put the term in quotation marks, as is increasingly the habit of many other scholars. Indeed, the term religion, quote unquote, itself is a construct serving a range of discursive and rhetorical purposes. The same could certainly be said for a variety of other overdetermined categories like orthodoxy and heresy. For any such terms, the interesting issue is not that they are artificial constructs, but rather how they are constructed and to what ends. In this book, I analyze the 20th century study of Gnosticism in order to illustrate where and how it has been entangled in the ancient Christian discourse of orthodoxy and heresy, and then disentangle them. This enterprise involves rethinking the framework, methods, and categories not only for Gnosticism, but also for the study of ancient Mediterranean religion more generally. For more on the approach I use in this book, see the note on methodology. Throughout this book, I contest the adequacy of accurate definitions of Gnosticism, and yet I continue to use the term. This practice may understandably occasion some difficulty for the reader. This difficulty can be eased somewhat by remembering that in this book I consider Gnosticism not as an ancient religion or even a set of groups and materials from antiquity, but rather as a problematic term that must be reevaluated. For this limited purpose, I will define Gnosticism as it has been employed in 20th century historiography. Historiography. Historically, Gnosticism is a term that belongs to the discourses of normative Christian identity formation. It has been used to refer to the following: 1. All varieties of early Christianity that are characterized by these discourses having too little or too negative an appropriation of Judaism. 2. An outside contamination of pure Christianity, either as the force that contaminated Christianity, as in theories of Gnosticism as an independent religion, or as a form of contaminated Christianity, where Gnosticism is understood to be a secondary deviation from the pure gospel. 3. Any number of traditions said to be closely related to this contaminated Christianity, whether or not they contain explicitly Christian elements such as Hermeticism, Platonizing Sethianism, Mandaism, Manichaeism, the Albigensian heresy, or the tenets of the medieval Cathars. It is these understandings of Gnosticism that I will explore in the following chapters. Take a break for a second, take a drink. I believe this is chapter 1. Why is Gnosticism so hard to define? Gnosis, esoteric knowledge of spiritual truth held by the ancient Gnostics to be essential to salvation. Gnostic, an adherent of Gnosticism. Gnosticism, the thought and practice, especially of various cults of late pre-Christian and early Christian centuries, distinguished by the conviction that matter is evil and that emancipation comes through gnosis. See, that's Webster's New Collegiate Dictionary. And already we're off to a wrong start, because that's, as far as, for lack of a better description or term, Sophianic Gnosticism or Telestic Gnosticism, that they don't define matter as being evil. So already we're already off to a bad start as far as that goes. But I mean, there's always going to be subversions of anything that's as old as these things are, for religion or history or whatever subject you want to cover. There's going to be some subversion involved. Anyway, let's continue. Despite the relative ease with which Webster's dictionary tackles the problem, defining the term Gnosticism, quote unquote, is one of the greatest challenges in Gnostic studies. The term is used so widely and in so many different senses that its precise meaning in any given case is often hard to discern. Indeed, not only is Gnosticism used to refer to certain types of ancient Christian heresy, but it has come to have significant application to in a variety of other areas, including philosophy, literary studies, politics, and psychology. It has been connected with Buddhism, nihilism, and other movements such as progressivism, positivism, and Hegelianism, and Marxism. Ruh-roh. Maybe the subversive types, I suppose, yeah. Gnosticism was pivotal to Carl Jung's reflection on the collective unconscious and archetypes. Gnostic themes have been detected in novels of Herman Melville, Lawrence Durrell, Walter Percy, among others. The literary critic Harold Bloom even contrived a new Gnostic novel, The Flight to Lucifer, a Gnostic fantasy. Gnosticism can also claim contemporary churches and practitioners, most especially the Mandaeans, however you want to pronounce it, who have survived for at least 16 centuries in the lands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, but who now, through persecution and emigration, face the dire possibility of extinction as a distinctive religious tradition. Moreover, Gnosticism is particularly well established among New Age groups. The subversive types, I suppose, are established in New Age groups, but New Age is a subversion in and of itself, anyways. A student in my Gnosticism seminar at Occidental College, who had been raised in the Los Angeles Gnostic Church, was in the class to learn more about his tradition, just as other students might wish to learn more about theirs. And all this is but the tip of the iceberg for contemporary Gnosticism. Ubiquity, however, is not the only problem in defining Gnosticism clearly. Even if we were to agree to limit the discussion to ancient Mediterranean world, to the ancient Mediterranean world of the 1st to 5th centuries, the problem would not be resolved, certainly not. It's too broad a stroke. Indeed, no widely accepted consensus has resulted from the many recent attempts to define Gnosticism, to characterize its nature and essence, to list its essential characteristics, or to establish its origins and trace its development. Scholars of Mediterranean antiquity are deeply divided over basic issues, which is not surprising in the least. Excuse me. The problem has become so muddled and so contentious that some have even suggested abandoning the term altogether and starting over with a fresh category. Simple as that solution may sound, until we solve the fundamental issues, the debates over new terms and categories will doubtless be as problematic as the old debates, even if cloaked in a new dress. It is crucial that we understand why Gnosticism is so difficult to define. At one time, it seemed that the problem was a matter of limited sources. Until recently, information about ancient Gnosticism came almost solely from the work of its detractors, primarily the Christian polemicists who wrote to promote their own theological views by refuting those of other Christians. Then came an influx of works stemming from both living and long extinct groups characterized by modern scholars as Gnostics. Manuscripts were brought to Europe from lands as far-flung as China, Egypt, Iran, and Iraq. The most significant discovery was the cache of papyrus books found in 1945 near Nag Hammadi. These fascinating new primary works might have been expected to solve the problem of definition, but in fact, they only exacerbated it by multiplying further an already wide variety of phenomena characterized as Gnostic. Through a circular reasoning, this huge amount of data seems to provide irrefutable evidence of the actual existence of Gnosticism, masking its artificial nature as a scholarly invention. How did such a variety of materials come to be classified under the single heading of Gnosticism? Modern scholars have tended to group together a wide variety of ancient persons, ideas, and texts described in the writings of the ancient Christian polemicists. With a few significant exceptions, early Christian polemicists did not call such groups Gnostics; rather, they labeled them as heretics. Bentley Layton And my headset uh, decided to turn off. That's dandy, but hopefully we can start back up again. Bentley Layton has argued that the term Gnosticism, quote unquote, was first used by Henry More in 1669 in the context of Protestant anti-Catholic polemics. More characterized Catholicism as more, oh man, wish he had a different name. More characterized Catholicism as, quote, a spice of the old abhorred Gnosticism, wasn't that, end quote, isn't that interesting? A kind of false prophecy that seduces true Christians to idolatry. That's kind of ironic to call Catholicism Gnosticism. Crazy Protestants. He probably coined the term from the title of a 2nd century CE work by Irenaeus of Lyon, expose and overthrow of what is falsely called knowledge, quote unquote, commonly known as against the heresies. The term knowledge, quote unquote, is translated from the Greek word gnosis, but in Gnosticism it has come to stand for false knowledge, in short, for heresy. The the early Christians understood Gnosticism to be a particular kind of heresy. Modern scholars have generally divided the earliest varieties of Christianity into three categories: Jewish Christianity, Gnosticism, and Orthodoxy. The first appropriated too much Judaism and took too positive an attitude toward it. The second appropriated too little and took too negative an attitude. Orthodoxy was just right, sailing between this Scylla and Charybdis, butchering these names, apparently safe from both dangers. Gnosticism as a category served important intellectual aims, defining the boundaries of normative Christianity, especially with reference to Judaism, and aiding colonialism by contrasting Gnosticism as an Oriental heresy with authentic Western religion. Moreover, it offered a single category to refer to a vast range of ideas, literary works, individuals, and groups. Repetition of the term by people of repute reinforced a sense of realism until its existence seemed unquestionable. Once Gnosticism had been accepted as a discrete historical phenomenon, scholars sought to locate its origin and characterize the content of its teaching. The writings of the ancient Christian polemicists fostered the search for a single origin based on their claim that heresy had one author, Satan, even as truth had one author, God. Scholars accepted in principle that all the manifold expressions of Gnosticism could be traced to a single origin, but they searched for the source in more historical places, like heterodox Judaism or Iranian myth. Yet, because they drew so heavily on the descriptions of the polemicists, they ended up characterizing Gnosticism almost solely in the polemicists' terms. That the true God did not create the world and humanity, uh, that that the true God did not create the world and humanity, that the world creator of Genesis was an ignorant and jealous pretender, that Christ never truly took on flesh and died, but only appeared to do so in order to fool the lower God and his angels. That'd be a funny ass troll. That one should love the spirit and hate the flesh. A view that could only lead either to a false aesthetic rejection of life or to a libertine flaunting of traditional mores. Gnostics were variously characterized as alienated rebels, nihilistically opposed to the world-affirming values of their day, as immoral and impious perverters of divine scripture, or as individualistic elitists who thought they were spiritually superior to everyone else and hence need not obey the priests and bishops. Such ideas were understood to mark the presence of Gnosticism. More recently, some have applauded the Gnostics, seeing them, as Tom Hall puts it, quote, like the Romantics in rebellion against the structure of classicism or orthodoxy, they focused on the individual rather than the group. They were liberals rather than holy Tories. That's a English terminology for their political system. That's definitely not American. Tom Hall must be British. Tories, or is that also Australian? I forget. One of those countries has that terminology for their political groupings. Anyways, the Quakers and Anabaptists of their day, not the Romans or High Anglicans. They were hippies, not corporate executives, spiritual people rather than attendees at divine services. They saw salvation in enlightenment, not ecclesiastical sanction. They were seekers after blessedness, not recipients of blessings. A priesthood of believers rather than believers in a priesthood. They were idealists, not church builders, people who would cheer for Ivan Karamazov, not for the Grand Inquisitor in his poem. End quote. Yet this portrait of Gnostics is equally reliant on the attacks of the polemicists. Only the appraisal differs. Whether such portraits provoke admiration or condemnation, they both manage to present the polemicists' views as objective history. That's going to be a key point, I think, in this book. She already pretty much vocalized it as such. There are other problems with the category as well. Some supposedly Gnostic ideas, such as cosmological dualism, hint hint, can be found in a wide variety of non-Gnostic literature. While they may be absent from many of the so-called Gnostic works, the dualism, cosmological dualism. The literature defies attempts to force its theological diversity into snug categorical cubbyholes. It is a bit like the child's game of putting the correct shape, a cylinder, cube, or pyramid, pyramid, into the correct hole. If you do not have blocks that match the holes, you can force them to fit by making the holes big enough to accommodate any of the shapes, or you can whittle away at the pieces until they have been reshaped to fit. But you can never really get the different shaped blocks to all fit into the same hole without some violence to the evidence. Nor, despite considerable intellectual energy devoted to the topic, have scholars been able to establish clear links between the new literary works and the persons or groups classified by the polemicists as heretics. The complexity and diversity of the materials complicates all such attempts. So profound is the problem that the very existence of Gnostic groups has been called into question. Some have suggested that because the content of Gnostic texts is so varied, it is possible that excuse me, It is possible that no distinct group corresponds to this designation. Instead, we might be dealing with an unknown number of groups so distinct from one another as to require separate treatment. I'd say that's kind of the case, yeah. Or perhaps the variety shows Gnostic thought to be so individualistic, quote unquote, and anti-authoritarian, quote unquote, as to preclude any group identity or organization. Yeah, there is some of that. Everyone has their own path, so to speak. As Jonathan Z. Smith puts it, we might consider Gnosticism to be merely, quote, a structural possibility within a number of religious traditions, end quote. Such considerations lead directly to, or perhaps stem directly from, a particularly thorny and widely recognized problem. Can we answer the question, what is Gnosticism, without asking, who were the Gnostics? Quote unquote. The discovery of new manuscripts has produced a wealth of new information, but it is almost solely of one kind, myth. Although the texts illustrate a wide variety of generic types, apocalypse, revelation, dialogue, epistle, hymn, prayer, and so on, the content is primarily expressive of mythic and occasionally ritual language. The hesitancy to define Gnosticism is directly related to the paucity of sociological information and the accompanying liability of writing social or even intellectual history primarily from mythological sources. We are left with little direct information about the identity of the individuals or groups that produced and read these texts. We can only speculate whether they were produced by individual mystics, sectarian enclaves, or in school settings. Dating is similarly difficult to establish, except for the terminus ad quem, supplied by the dates of the surviving manuscripts. What little information we do have from the ancient polemicists and the new text is very scarce and must be read with an eye toward the rhetorical strategies and interests of both the polemicists and the text's authors. Even religious identity is a matter of hot dispute. Are these Christian heresies, Jewish heterodox writings, evidence of a Platonizing philosophical underground? What do heresy and heterodoxy and underground movement, quote unquote, imply? In short, all the information basic to modern historiography is missing or in short supply, and this dearth seriously limits our ability to answer historical questions about the identity of Gnosticism. Determining how to write social history from myth is surely one of the thorniest issues in ancient historiography. Although there is no direct relation between myth and social practice, that is, myths do not provide rules for behavior, let alone descriptions of actual behaviors. A cosmological myth, such as the Apocryphon of John, a work found in both the Berlin Codex and at Nag Hammadi, does provide a framework within which practices and choices can be oriented and made meaningful. Such a framework will make some practices more likely than others. For example, the use of powerful and positive female imagery of the divine could potentially have empowered women to play leadership roles, but it does not necessarily prove that they ever did. Additional additional corroboration additional corroboration would be necessary to make that possibility into a historical probability. Moreover, as Victor Turner cautions, Myths are not merely, quote, to be treated as models for secular behavior. What the initiated seeks through rite and myth is not a moral exemplum so much as the power to transcend the limits of his previous status, although he knows he must accept the normative restraints of his new status, end quote. In Apocryphon of John, this is the abbreviation from those abbreviation list earlier. In the Apocryphon of John, the new status achieved through baptismal ritual and myth involves the reception of the Spirit, and with it the capacity to be free from the fetters of the counterfeit spirit who traps the soul through illegitimate domination, ignorance, and suffering. The new status confers ethical freedom and spiritual power, achieved both through baptism and through knowledge of the truth about the nature of the world and the true God. How this new status would translate into actual behaviors is another matter. There are indications, however, that those who used the Apocryphon of John practiced exorcism for physical healing, encouraged sexual abstinence, and strove for apatheia, a state in which the psychic passions of desire, grief, and uh, apatheia, a state in which the psychic passions of desire, grief, anger, envy, and greed would be completely extinguished. Thus, we can delve into a text like the Apocryphon of John to discover how it assesses the cultural values of its own day. Surprisingly enough, at least in view of the usual stereotypes about Gnostic rebellion, quote unquote, the Apocryphon of John presents a strong affirmation of its culture's values, along with a biting critique of their perversion. Its its attitude is less rebellious, quote unquote, than idealistic and utopian. Thus, while there are decided limitations to using myth to describe social practices or construct group histories, it can be a fascinating indicator of how people were oriented toward certain behaviors, how these behaviors were conceptualized, and how patterns of meaning and belonging were constructed. Pause. 19th and 20th century scholarship has been dominated by two methods for defining Gnosticism. One, determining its historical origin and genealogical development, and two, establishing its essential characteristics typologically. The first method links origin with essence, assuming that if a particular phenomenon's point of origin can be identified, then we have learned something about its essential character and meaning, as well as its history. Adolf von Harnack offers a good example of this approach, as we will see in greater detail in Chapter 3. He located the essence of Christianity in the earliest and purest form of the teaching of Jesus. Gnosticism arose when this pure form was contaminated by Greek religious and intellectual influences. Exposing this historical process, Harnack believed allowed exposing this historical process, Harnack believed, allowed the original purity of the true Christian piety to reemerge in his own theology. Here essence coincides with origin, and development is figured as a process of decline and restoration. Hans Jonas, by contrast, rejected the proposition that the origin of Gnosticism lay in a single historical site as the contamination of Christianity, arguing instead that it arose simultaneously in a variety of ancient Mediterranean locales. as a distinct religion, yet he too identified origin with essence. Gnosticism, he contended, arose from the existential experience of human alienation. It is therefore a possibility for every age and every time, despite the fact that it was clothed in the dress of antiquity. Jonas's understanding belongs to the demythologizing methods of the German intellectual circles of his day, which allowed the essence of a phenomenon to be abstracted from the particularities of its historical expression. Yet the notion that essence and origin coincide remained fundamental to Jonas's definition of Gnosticism. Despite their contradictory solutions to the problem of Gnostic origins, both Harnack and Jonas, both uh, both Harnack and Jonas shared the presupposition that locating the origin of Gnosticism would simultaneously determine its essence and meaning. This shared assumption has been thoroughly confounded by the new materials, in part because of the variety of the materials classified under this compendious designation, and in part because historical study cannot posit true origins nor determined essences. To locate an original pure form of Christianity, to chart the process of pagan contamination, or to find existential alienation in all the varied materials is simply not as easy as Harnack and Jonas supposed. Even if it were possible, the results would be dubious because, as George Eliot puts it so beautifully, quote, "No retrospect will take us to the true beginning. And whether our prologue be in heaven or on earth, it is but a fraction of all presupposing fact with which our story sets out." End quote. History can only trace continuity in difference. Historians can only heuristically posit the origin of a phenomenon as a point of difference amid that continuity. And historical difference is never a matter of purity in essence, but a function of the rational possibilities produced in ever-shifting historical positions. The second dominant approach, typology, uses uh, phenomenological method based on inductive reasoning from a literary analysis of the primary materials. Gnosticism is defined by listing the essential characteristics common to all the phenomena classified as Gnostic. The most accomplished practitioner of this method was Hans Jonas. His greatest contribution was to shift the discussion of Gnosticism away from genealogy to typology. Rather than define Gnosticism by locating precisely where and how heretics deviated from true original Christianity, Jonas defined the essence of Gnosticism by listing a discrete set of defining characteristics. Unfortunately, detailed study of the texts has led scholars to question every element of the standard typologies constructed by Jonas and others. Yeah, I'll bet. In particular, specialists have challenged the cliché of Gnosticism as a radically dualistic, anti-cosmic tradition capable of producing only two extreme ethical possibilities: either an aesthetic avoidance of any fleshly and worldly contamination, often caricatured as hatred of the body and the world, or a depraved libertinism that mocks any standards of moral behavior. It's like two extremes. Like it's, thesis, antithesis, synthesis going on here as it's being kind of framed here. I don't think that's obviously how it should be framed. In fact, the texts show a variety of cosmological positions, not only the presence of anti-cosmic dualism, but also milder forms of dualism, transcendentalism, and most surprisingly, both radical and moderate forms of monism. The majority of the texts show a tendency toward aesthetic values much in line with the broad currents of 2nd to 5th century piety, and some argue for the validity of marriage, attack the human vices of greed and sexual immorality, and promote virtues such as self-control and justice, also ethical themes common in their day. That no treatises supporting libertinism have been found may, of course, be simply a matter of chance. It is nonetheless telling. Part of the problem with typological definitions lies again with variety. Part lies with the uncritical appropriation of the judgments of the ancient anti-Gnostic polemicists, for example, in making impiety one of the essential characteristics of Gnosticism. A greater stumbling block, however, is the conception of how ideas are related to practice. The assumption of demythologizing is that the essence of a phenomenon can be abstracted and removed from its husk, quote unquote, that is, from the particular expressive form in which it appears. This view, however, is no longer tenable. Meaning and expression are we're really struggling with this one. Indissolubly, that word. Indissolubly. Oh man, I'm really butchering that one. That word tied. And moreover, meaning itself is local, specific, and socially constructed in the actual development of a myth or symbol of practice. Here again, we run into the limits of what we can and cannot be known about how Gnostic myth was performed in practice. Acknowledging such limits is necessary for disciplining historical imagination. Moreover, the phenomenological distinction between thought and practice, essence and form, presupposes an untenable dualist epistemology. The work of sociologists such as Pierre Bourdieu clearly illustrates that thought is a kind of practice, that the formation of social ideology as a practical link to social relations, economics, and politics, the evocation of a symbol or telling an old story a new way, can in and of itself produce a practical social effect. In trying to interpret ancient texts, we do well not to essentialize their contents, but to ask what work they are doing in practice and for whom. The ultimate problem in defining Gnosticism may lie with the nature of definitions themselves. Both historical genealogical origins and typological definitions take essentialist approaches to defining Gnosticism. That is, in Raziel Abelson's terms, they assume that definitions provide, quote, precise and rigorous knowledge, end quote, quote, serve the purpose of providing descriptive information about their objects, end quote, and offer, quote, a causal explanation of the thing defined, end quote. Accordingly, quote, systematic classification is identical with theoretical explanation, end quote. Bentley Layton has recently introduced a new nominalist approach to defining Gnosticism. Nominalism, in Abelson's words, is a, quote, means of clearing up and avoiding ambiguous, vague, and obscure language, end quote, by, quote, subjecting existing concepts to the test of definitional reduction to observable and measurable properties, end quote. Nominalist formalist views further suggest that definitions are useful primarily as an economical shorthand for a shorthand form of notation. Layton begins by identifying cases where the terms Gnostic, quote unquote, and Gnostics, quote unquote, are used in Greek texts to refer to a distinct social group. From this strictly philological starting point, he then develops a set of methodological propositions for identifying, quote, other undenominated textual material that can be recognized as being Gnostic and thus added to the Gnostic database, end quote. The resultant term Gnosticism, quote unquote, refers to this delimited set of data. Both essentialist and nominalist approaches to defining Gnosticism offer certain advantages and raise certain problems. Although the former work strategically destabilize definitions by pointing to the original meaning as the true meaning or by delimiting a fixed set of essential characteristics, they simultaneously tend to reify historical materials into static and artificial entities, obscuring the rhetorical and ideological functions of defining Gnosticism. Moreover, insofar as the determination of origins remains general, obscure, or imprecise, so does meaning. Essentialist approaches are unable to cope with the variety of phenomena classified as Gnostic. No one definition, no one solution to the question of origin, no one set of typological categories can suffice. Nominalism is extremely useful in pointing toward terminological clarity. Nevertheless, this approach tends, quote, to reduce definition to historical reports of linguistic behavior, end quote, or to derive inductive categories from linguistic behavior so that it becomes necessary to look elsewhere to explore the meaning of the phenomena behind the arbitrary assignment of categorical names to elements of a historical record. Although categorization is a mode of definition, Layton's actual definition excludes from the category of Gnosticism the majority of the phenomena that have been classified as Gnostic. This suggests the need for recategorization of the excluded material, and in fact, Layton's work points towards just such an alternative categorization. A more serious difficulty is that Layton's nominalizing approach requires supplementary methods to establish larger contexts in which meaning can be explored, and is therefore compatible with the essentializing approaches of origins and typology. In short, we could end up back where we started. I'd say so, and go around in circles. Where do these observations leave us? Any definition is limited insofar as it calls attention to certain aspects or characteristics of a set of phenomena while ignoring or hiding others. Definitions tend to produce static and reified entities and hide the rhetorical and ideological interests of their fabricators. Nowhere has this reification been accomplished more comprehensively than with Gnosticism, which is much more often treated as a historical entity than as a definitional category. Despite uh, despite these rather serious limitations, neither is it possible to give up definitions altogether. Recognizing these difficulties, uh, Abelson has offered a helpful suggestion in what he calls, quote, a pragmatic contextualist approach to definition. In this approach, definitions are formed and evaluated in terms of the purposes they are designed to serve. He writes, quote, definitions are good if and only if they serve the purpose for which they are intended. Thus, an evaluation of a definition must begin with the identification of the point or purpose of the definition, and this requires knowledge of the discursive situation in which the need for the definition arises. The practical value of any account of the nature of definition is to be found in the clarity of the standards it provides for judging when a definition is good or bad. What must be stated in a definition varies with the definition's purpose, end quote. Because definitions and the criteria for determining their adequacy will vary depending on purpose and discursive situation, definitions are to be regarded as both provisional and positional. From this perspective, definitions are treated as intellectual tools in the historian's workbox. The provisionality of each tool is tied to its having been the provisionality of each tool is tied to its having been crafted to suit some particular task. Its adequacy is determined by its capacity to do its intended job. Recognizing definitions as positional requires analysis of the discursive situation in which a definition is constructed and deployed, including analysis of who is using the definition, for what ends, and in whose interests. Abelson's approach immediately shows up one of the primary reasons that defining Gnosticism has become so muddled. The problem mainly arises because scholars have not clearly formulated what it is we want to know when we study Gnosticism. The nature of much historical discourse assumes that, quote, the past, end quote, is a given, and the task at hand is simply to recover it. For example, to represent Gnosticism through the disciplined practices of historical methods according to established standards. Once Gnosticism has been objectified and certain existing source materials, such as papyrus manuscripts, have been ascribed to it, it becomes possible to recover Gnosticism from the past. In this mode, what historians want to know is the truth about the past, the true past, the past as it actually was. The early 20th century historian of religion Wilhelm Bousset, um, for example, claimed that, quote, the actual historical course of events has always proved to be more strange, more diverse, and richer than the theories posed in advance. The work in the history of religions certainly has not developed in this area out of preconceived theories. It has been shaped under the compulsion of the facts, and it can do nothing at all better than, in ever more intensive labor, to let the facts speak for themselves. Then the dispute over theories will clear up by itself and will come to an end. Whether in the present book I have succeeded in letting the facts speak for themselves and in approximating the actual course of events may be left to the judgment of those whose calling it is to form such judgments, end quote. This eschewal of any, quote, preconceived theories, end quote, along with the invocation of, quote, the compulsion of the facts, end quote, and the disciplining of the professional makes it impossible to reflect on or articulate the purposes Bousset might have had in giving his account of Gnosticism. It is the facts that are speaking, not the historian, assuming he or she is doing the job right. Few, if any, historians of Gnosticism today would make such a bald claim, for historians now recognize and acknowledge that the questions we ask are important determinants of the outcome of historical reconstruction. Nevertheless, the continuing lack of explicit conversation about the purposes of defining Gnosticism shows that the tendency to objectify the past is still operating. The issue is not whether it is appropriate to use definitions to articulate particular identities. Indeed, the very fact that definitions of Gnosticism are all tied to rhetorical and ideological practices is in itself no criticism. It is neither possible nor desirable to escape the world of practice and its politics. The sphere of practice is the social world that all humanity inhabits, one way or another. Rather, the issue is whether it is possible to give a critical evaluation of a definition. When we view definitions as provisional and positional, their rhetorical and ideological uses can become more apparent and more readily visible for analysis and evaluation than is possible with essentializing definitions. In order to provide any adequate definition of Gnosticism, then, we must identify clearly the definition's purpose and provide standards for judging when the definition is good or bad, adequate or inadequate. In performing the task of definition for historical studies, it is crucial not to reify definitions by attributing them to a past reality that they have only in our present discourse about them. Or more precisely, by attributing to them the capacity to function as determiners of practice. For example, we often hear that many elements of orthodoxy, including the doctrine of apostolic succession, the formation of a closed canon, and an exclusive rule of faith, creed, were shaped in reaction to the threat posed by Gnosticism. In this model, the ability of Gnosticism to provoke a response from the church, quote unquote, is understood as a direct cause for the development of these crucial elements of orthodoxy. Here, Gnosticism, a scholarly construct invented to define the origin and essential characteristics shared by a wide variety of ancient materials, has become an entity capable of acting in history and causing events. Understanding the term as a provisional category should help avoid such distortions. Abelson's pragmatic contextualist approach not only aids in formulating a direction for future attempts at defining Gnosticism, but also help to explain a final difficulty that contributes to some of the current confusion. One source of our problem may be that we are attempting to determine a single definition of Gnosticism that is adequate to serve the wide variety of purposes to which the term is put. When defining Gnosticism, was understood fundamentally to be the task of refining our knowledge of one prominent type of early Christian heresy, it was clear who wanted to know what they wanted to know and why. Christian polemicists wanted their readers to know where deception led people astray from the truth in order to help them avoid error. These motivations were and still are strong among historians of Christianity. Indeed, the fundamental and pervasive perception that Gnosticism is a heresy remains a crucial factor in both the ways it is defined and the actual content of the definitions. That is to say, the problem of defining Gnosticism has been and continues to be primarily an aspect of the ongoing project of defining and maintaining a normative Christianity. As long as defining Gnosticism was still primarily about determining the historical identity of Christianity, its purpose remained largely the same as that of heresy. Heresy appears to be a very tidy category. Its purpose is to distinguish right and wrong belief and behavior, define insider-outsider boundaries, and establish clear lines of power and authority. Gnosticism has often performed these same functions. It has marked the erroneous, the heretical, the schismatic, as well as all things threatening, anomalous, esoteric, and arcane. In the 20th century, however, Gnosticism has come to serve a number of other purposes. For the philosopher Hans Jonas, it marked an episode in the history of human alienation. For the historian Bentley Layton, it locates the data to reconstruct an ancient religious group. Psychological and literary studies have employed it to refer to mysterious archetypes or dualistic themes. Plainly, using the same term for such different purposes has impossibly complicated our ability to define Gnosticism clearly. So, what do we wish to know from a study of Gnosticism? Christianity in all its variety? Why? To provide more options for contemporary theological reflection? To put normative Christianity on a firm historical foundation by showing the superiority of its particular structures and traditions? To legitimate changes to the definitional norms and practices of contemporary Christians, feminist, liberationist, evangelical? To understand Gnostic phenomena as exempla of the religious experiences of humanity and hence as possibilities for us? To plumb the depths of human intellectual folly? Or is the task more limited? Is it to distinguish a self-identified group and a complex of textual materials? To elucidate the meaning of obscure passages in ancient literature? My purpose in this book is to consider the ways in which the early Christian polemicists' discourse of orthodoxy and heresy has been intertwined with 20th century scholarship on Gnosticism in order to show where and how that involvement has distorted our analysis of the ancient texts. At stake is not only the capacity to write a more accurate history of ancient Christianity in all its multiformity, but also our capacity to engage critically the ancient politics of religious difference rather than unwittingly reproduce its strategies and results. It's the end of chapter 1. I think we'll stop there. I think she's setting out a pretty good foundation here to make distinctions that need to be made. And part of that, and the problem of this defining Gnosticism, is that there's so many groups of supposed Gnostics that they all had each individual practices and ideologies and so forth, that it's like trying to it would be like trying to say put a blanket statement on, as though Catholics and Protestants and Eastern Orthodox are all in the same group, when they all have differing beliefs and doctrines and dogmas. It's You can't just blanket statement. I mean, you could. The blanket statement would be Christian, obviously, but that's it becomes pretty vacuous once you start delving into each individual group in those categories. So I think she's making a very good point here. So that is kind of funny that the end of the chapter lands on page 33. I think that's pretty funny. So that's it for this installment of the reading.